Yemen secret torture prisons. U.S. politicians want to know whether there's an American connection to the disappearance of hundreds of prisoners. Have U.S. forces broken the law by torturing suspects during interrogation? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Folly. Thibault. The U.S. House of Representatives has voted to investigate the U.S. role in torture prisons in Yemen and wants the Defense Secretary to find out. The Associated Press says hundreds of men captured in the hunt for al-Qaida fighters in southern Yemen disappeared into a secret network of prisons. And Human Rights Watch found that the United Arab Emirates and its allies detained and tortured hundreds of people in their three-year war against Houthi rebels. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Rob Reynolds has more from Washington.
The Associated Press news agency was the first to uncover the existence of a network of secret prisons in Yemen run by the United Arab Emirates in a report published last year. The 18 secret prisons reportedly have as many as 2,000 prisoners, and those prisoners have been subjected to a variety of brutal tortures, including electric shocks, beatings, burning, and sexual abuse. Those findings were largely confirmed by a special panel of experts appointed by the UN. Now, this legislation passed by the House is part of a much larger Defense Department budget bill. It would have to go to the Senate to be then sent on to President Trump for his signature to become law. The Senate just recently voted to approve Gina Haspel as director of the CIA. Ms. Haspel was allegedly involved in activities including torture at U.S. black site prisons in earlier years. According to U.S. law, it is illegal for U.S. personnel to be involved in torture. However, those protections are much less stringent when it comes to surrogates or U.S. allies actually carrying out the brutal acts. The U.S. has been supporting the UAE and Saudi Arabia in their battle against Houthi rebels in Yemen for about the past 3 years.
Well, the Associated Press investigation says secret prisons are in military bases, ports, an airport, villas, even a nightclub. Some detainees have been flown to an Emirati base across the Red Sea in Eritrea. U.S. defense officials acknowledged U.S. involvement in interrogations to AP, but denied any knowledge of human rights abuses. Former inmates described being crammed into shipping containers, blindfolded for weeks on end, and smeared with excrement. At the main detention center at Riyadh Airport in the southern city of Mukalla, they said they were beaten, trussed up, and sexually assaulted. Well, let's bring in our guest now for today's Inside Story. Joining us in Beirut is Kristine Beckerle. She's the Yemen and UAE researcher at Human Rights Watch. In Sana'a, Hakim al-Masmari, editor-in-chief of the Yemen Post. And in Hamana, Lebanon, Nabeel Khouri, a former U.S. diplomat and former deputy chief of mission in Yemen. A warm welcome to you all. Thank you for being on Inside Story. Kristine, if I can start with you in Beirut, how hopeful are you that any investigation by the U.S. into the role of American troops in the torture of detainees in Yemen's secret prisons can actually bring an end to what goes on in these prisons?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. And I think the real first question is what's going to happen in the Senate. So it's a big step forward that the House has pushed this amendment through, but we're a ways away from the U.S. in fact investigating and publicly discussing what they find in terms of the UAE's role in torture and abuse. And I emphasize that because AP released their report in June 2017. Human Rights Watch released a report that same month. And Yemeni activists and lawyers have been talking about UAE abuse even before those reports were released. And yet we still have very little information regarding the ways in which the U.S. is engaging with the UAE on this issue. And the UAE in large part continues to deny any role in abuse, despite the fact that evidence continues to mount, not only that they, but also their proxies are involved in abuse.
Nabeel Khouri in Hamana, do you agree with Kristine, who says who seems to believe that we're a long way from an actual investigation into the U.S. role in these abuses. It might take a very long time.
Yes, I agree. And certainly until the elections of November 2018, because right now the majority in Congress in both houses are Republicans. And unfortunately, Donald Trump seems to own the Republican Party, despite all the scandals that have been coming out. So when the Democrats become a majority, if they become a majority after November elections, then these investigations on the Hill will have a better chance of going the distance and producing public information and censure against any U.S. officials involved in this.
Hakim al-Masmari in Sana'a, your thoughts. The measure voted on by the House of Representatives, if it goes through and there is an investigation, would require the Pentagon investigate the U.S. allies and what they've been doing in Yemen, but also whether American troops were involved in any form of torture in these so-called secret prisons in Yemen. Just how difficult will it be to conduct such an investigation on the ground when it actually happens?
Very difficult, to be honest with you. And it's very difficult also to find any proof that U.S. forces were involved in the torture itself. We talked to a couple of senior intelligence officials in the South allied to the UAE. They did confirm that these secret prisons were present, that the torture was present, but I could not get any confirmation that U.S. forces were involved in the torture. They were aware of the torture. U.S. forces were aware of the torture, and at times were present during the tortures. But I personally feel that it's very hard to get evidence that the U.S. forces were directly involved in the torture, rather than being aware of it or being in the picture.
Hakim, who do we know is actually committing the actual abuse, the tortures in these secret prisons? I know there's been an investigation by the AP. What more information do we have about the perpetrators of these alleged abuses?
First of all, the U.S. does not need to torture anyone in Yemen, because they always have Arabs to do it for them. So the UAE, the Saudis, even the Yemenis themselves at times would rather do anything for the U.S. if asked to. So they would do their crimes for them, and they will be held responsible on the other side. But as of now, the evidence that we have through confirmations from officials, majority through UAE forces who have led the tortures, and in coordination with the U.S. government and with the knowledge of the U.S. government, but the torture has been undertaken by UAE forces. Now, what we are also aware is that the torture has very much decreased over the last 4 months, especially since January, for I don't know what reason. Yes, it's still present. Yes, it still happens, but at a much less extent that it used to happen when the Human Rights Watch report and the AP report were launched last June.
Kristine Beckerle in Beirut. So what sort of evidence is there about these abuses, mostly, we understand, committed in prisons in southern Yemen? What sort of research is out there to justify an investigation on the part of the U.S. into its role in all this?
Well, I think the evidence of the UAE's role and UAE-backed proxy forces in Yemen is clear. So when Human Rights Watch did our report last year, which was released in June 2017, we did interviews with dozens of people, former detainees, family members, lawyers, activists, officials. We got photos of some people's injuries. We talked to people who themselves had been abused. We met with people who had been working on these cases for months and months and months. And again, say you didn't believe anything that we reported, which you should, but say you didn't believe anything we reported, then the Associated Press did a separate investigation. The UN panel of experts 2 years in a row has done investigations on the UAE and UAE-backed proxy forces' role in detainee-related abuse. And again, like I said, Yemeni activists, lawyers, and organizations have been doing their own investigations and work on this. So that evidence, I think, is clear and almost undeniable. The big question mark is, as has been said, what the U.S. role is. So the U.S. told the Associated Press, and the U.S. has said very clearly publicly, that they're working closely with the UAE in South Yemen in counterterror operations. But again, the question mark is, okay, well, how does that then translate to what they knew about the abuse that was happening against detainees and what role, if any, they had in abuse? And I think the only way we get to those answers is, again, through impartial investigations, which is why I do sort of salute the efforts in the House to push this forward. And I hope the Senate is as courageous to push this forward. But I very much worry that unless Congress steps up, the executive, given the fact that they've basically been silent on this for around a year, won't. So it really is up to Congress to push these kinds of transparency questions and conversations forward.
And Nabeel, Khouri, as Kristine says there, I mean, there have been various investigations into these alleged abuses in these torture prisons in Yemen, and yet we have seen no action taken on the international level anyway. Can there be a serious, genuine U.S. investigation into this when you consider that the new CIA chief, Gina Haspel, was involved in these kinds of black site operations before? Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, has endorsed torture. Even the U.S. President, Donald Trump, has endorsed torture. Can we expect any genuine investigation into this?
Well, I'm not very optimistic, Station. I think ideologically they are on the wrong track, and they don't seem to care very much human rights abuses. And in terms of expertise, Donald Trump gathered around him a stellar group of experts on anything. Most of them seem to be incompetent ideologues. But I think there are 2 points that need to be made here. In terms of investigations and ascertaining the truth, listen to independent Yemeni voices, and they do exist. There are Yemeni journalists who are risking their lives to cover these issues. And I think in Congress and in the international media, these voices need to be heard. They have first-hand stories. And the stories about the Emirates torture have been confirmed not only in South Yemen, but in the UAE itself. The second point that should be made is that even if American personnel are not directly involved of this going on or have been watching it going on, that violates American law. The use of American equipment, weapons, and personnel are prohibited when it is known that the third party using them against civilians, and that includes the use of torture.
Hakim al-Masmari, you're a Yemeni journalist. Tell us first what we know precisely about the role of U.S. troops in Yemen. What are they doing there?
Not in Yemen in general, but in South Yemen, to be specific. They are working through their allies, as Mr. Nabeel Khouri mentioned, in South Yemen, especially the UAE. And they are in charge, or are giving the intel, if needed, to the UAE forces, to the Saudi forces when it comes to attacks, or when it comes to imprisonment of certain targets or suspects that could be civilians, etc. So their role is intelligence giving, their role is to evaluate, their role has also been to be present during these interrogations if needed on high-level targets or suspects, and very direct role. And they are aware of what's happening inside these interrogation rooms, and but are not directly involved in the torture itself.
Kristine, do you agree with Hakim there, who says that the U.S. forces are aware, the U.S. troops are aware of what's going on in these interrogation rooms, but perhaps choosing to turn a blind eye to what's happening there?
Well, I think the question is what time period we're talking about, because, and that's why I was emphasizing earlier, at this point, it wouldn't be plausible for U.S. officials to say that they're not aware that the UAE and UAE proxy forces are involved in abuse in South Yemen. Because again, the evidence at this point about that part of the puzzle, it's been mounting for over a year. And so the question is, what have they done now that that evidence has come to light, not only to ensure that their own officials are not complicit in abuse, as has been raised, but also that their allies are not committing abuse. Because as is the problem across the Yemen war more largely, including against the Houthis, but also in South Yemen, it really isn't just, the U.S. should not be just concerned, was a U.S. person themselves doing the torturing? They should also be concerned, if we're working closely with the UAE, and if they're doing, as they admitted to the AP in June, sending questions, reading interrogation transcripts, sending interrogators into some of these detention facilities, whether they were there or not when the abuse was happening, that puts them in a position of ability to influence the behavior of the UAE and UAE-backed Yemeni forces, as well as at legal risk of complicity in some of these abuses. And that's what's so frustrating about the fact that there hasn't been, it doesn't appear to be real action or at least transparency on the part of the U.S. as to what in the world they've done now that all of this evidence has come to light about their key counterterror ally partner being involved in some of these horrific abuses. And I do kind of want to emphasize that they could, and that's what's so frustrating, is that if Congress were to step up, the U.S. could play a good role in terms of pushing and making very clear that torture is unacceptable. But as has been mentioned by some of the other commentators, at this point it needs to be Congress, because the executive has not made that clear in any way. In fact, the opposite. So Congress really needs to, at this point in sort of U.S. political dynamics, make very clear where they stand. And that's why I very much hope that the Senate follows the House's example and does have a real conversation and does push this notion of an investigation forward.
Right. Let me bring in Nabeel in Hamana once again. We were talking about the U.S. role in Yemen. Is there sufficient transparency, in your view, about what the U.S. is doing right now in Yemen?
There is nothing transparent about what this administration does anywhere in the world, not even in Washington. So to begin with, I have very little faith. In Yemen itself, the focus for the past 10 years has been on counterterrorism operations. The target has mainly been al-Qaida and to some extent ISIS in Yemen. In pursuit of these terrorists, the U.S. has worked with local security officials. Now with the war in Yemen, they seem to work more with the UAE. Now, in both cases, even when President Saleh was president, and we worked with his security organizations, there was always a bias in the information being relayed to U.S. officials. And therefore, U.S. intelligence officials rely on security forces on the ground and on the UAE. And so instead of bringing them al-Qaeda people to interrogate, they often bring them dissidents, political opponents, Houthis if they can grab a hold of them, or people suspected of being friends of the Houthis. Now this casts a wide net. And it ends up that the U.S. is being involved in targeting people who should be innocent until proven guilty. And there is no way that these people have been proven guilty by anyone.
But so some would say, how can there be a process of justice in a country like Yemen right now? And Kristine, I want to bring that to you. How can there be an investigation and a process of justice in Yemen when you have an ongoing war, a civil conflict? Can that happen simultaneously?
You do have an ongoing war, but at the same time, you have, when we're talking about an investigation, we're talking about, first of all, what in the world has happened on the U.S. side? What are they doing? Where have they been? What have they known? That should be able to happen regardless of the circumstances in Yemen.
Right.
Same thing goes for the UAE. What have our partners known? What have they been doing? Where have they been? Where have they been holding people? And what have they done to ensure that they're not only not torturing people, which they should absolutely not be doing, but not arbitrarily detaining people, forcibly disappearing people? And then finally, on the Yemen side, yes, there's still a conflict in Yemen, but in, for example, Aden, where we documented many of these abuses, you also have lawyers, you have people who really are committed to trying to push the notion of some form of fair process forward. And the conversation has always been, well, it's a war, so we can't have appropriate criminal justice standards. But the very fact is, international law still applies when there's a conflict, and there's certain rights that don't get derogated during a conflict. And there are ways in which there could absolutely be investigations into what's going on. And I think the very obvious evidence of that is there have been impartial, independent investigations. So again, not only Human Rights Watch, but a UN panel of experts, Associated Press, Yemeni journalists, activists, and organizations. Somehow we've all managed to do real, serious, in-depth investigations into these issues. And so one would think that the U.S., working with the UAE, working with the Yemeni government, working with Yemeni civil society, would similarly be able to uncover and do a real investigation should the political will exist. But I think the question, again, comes back to, does the political will exist? And we know it doesn't exist on the executive side. And this is really, this question is really a litmus test for Congress, because at this point, The war in Yemen is 3 years old. There's a variety of files whereby the U.S. is not only working with allies who are committing frequent laws of war violations, but the U.S. itself is exposing itself to the risk of complicity. And so when will Congress step up, either on the question of torture in South Yemen or on unlawful attacks in North Yemen? It's really, and this is an opportunity for Congress to do so and make very clear that, no, we are not willing to work with allies who torture. It's unacceptable, and we're making this clear to the executive branch, to the White House, that it's not acceptable in Yemen and it's not acceptable across the globe.
Hakim al-Masmari, I'm going to put to you the same question I asked Kristine there a second ago. Can there be a meaningful investigation into these human rights abuses in Yemen? Can justice be rendered when there's an actual conflict, when people are dying? Can this happen simultaneously?
It's very sad that the U.S. administration has lost its reputation. The current U.S. administration has lost its reputation in Yemen, especially for many of the violations that have been ongoing, whether in the north for the attacks, the Saudi attacks, or in the south, the UAE torture cases, etc. So I am very pessimistic on this. I don't feel that there is a will in general to take this forward. The Human Rights Report has been there for almost a year now, and it was basically ignored by U.S. media, U.S. authorities, or currently right now running the country. So there's no will right now, and as I guess Mr. Khouri said, Congress right now and the Senate are both controlled by the Republicans. Right. So they're basically not willing to take this forward. So if this case is to go forward, it has to happen maybe after November, after we see what happens in the next elections. But for now, I am very pessimistic that anything will happen.
Nabeel, Khouri, what about other international actors? We've talked a lot about the U.S. In our discussion. The airstrikes by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen have killed many, of course, and Saudi Arabia, we know, has fought a recent inquiry into what's been happening on the ground in Yemen. The UK also has fought inquiries into its role in Yemen. There seems to be opposition from various parts of the international community to investigate these abuses that are committed in Yemen.
Definitely, I think the Europeans should investigate this thoroughly. Unfortunately, the Brits, at least in terms of soldiers on the ground, have been working hand in glove with U.S. forces. The intelligence agencies of both countries work together very closely. And so to the extent that the U.S. is implicated in acts of torture or violence against civilians, the Brits are just as implicated as the Americans are. I must point out here that the U.S. has been in war zones in the Middle East for the past 10 years, since 9/11 at least. And being in a war zone does not exonerate you from following orders. And the Army Book of Rules has many procedures. American laws of war are very clear. And if these laws are being implemented properly, we should not be getting stories of this sort.
Okay. I'm just going to try and give the last word to Kristine in Beirut. Kristine, I know you think we're a long way from an actual investigation, but fast forward, to when there is an investigation. If there is evidence that the U.S. military or intelligence personnel participated in these abuses being committed in these secret prisons in Yemen, then what? I mean, has anyone ever been held to account when it comes to these so-called black sites?
Well, I mean, I think that the conversation around Gina Haspel is a good reminder why we should take conversations around accountability seriously. I mean, so yes, the U.S. has absolutely failed on the question of accountability for the role of U.S. personnel in torture during the quote-unquote war on terror. But my very strong hope is that if anything has come of the last few years, it's that it's made clear that when we say things like people need to be held to account and justice needs to be done, it's not just about looking to the past, it's also about looking to the future. So even for Republicans, if they believe that they have a stance against torture, then that includes holding people to account, both for U.S. personnel role in torture, and again, if we have allies who are involved in torture, that we make very, very clear that that's unacceptable.
Okay. We'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Kristine Beckerle, for speaking to us. Hakim al-Masmari in Sana'a, thank you as well. And, of course, Nabeel, Khouri, thank you for taking part in this edition of Inside Story. And thank you for watching. As always, you can watch this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can, also, of course, also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folly, Thibault, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.